In the summer of 1919, America found itself on the edge of a storm. Across more than 30 cities, tension that had been building for decades finally erupted. Streets that had once been filled with workers heading to factories or families walking home from church became battlegrounds of fear, uncertainty, and unrest. Communities that had struggled to build a future suddenly faced destruction, their dreams scattered in the chaos. It was a season that would later be remembered as the Red Summer, a phrase that carries with it both the weight of tragedy and the urgency of memory. To understand how this happened, we have to place ourselves in that moment. Picture a country still recovering from the First World War. Thousands of African American soldiers had returned home, believing their service would finally earn them a respected place in society. Instead, they were met not with gratitude but with suspicion and hostility. At the same time, the Great Migration was reshaping the nation. Families left the rural South in search of new beginnings in cities like Chicago, Washington, and Detroit. They hoped for better jobs, safer neighborhoods, and the dignity that comes with opportunity. But those dreams collided with the fears of white workers and residents who saw newcomers as competitors, not neighbors. The press and media of the time often made matters worse. Stories were twisted, headlines sensationalized, and entire communities unfairly painted as threats. That constant drumbeat of misinformation stoked anxiety and deepened divides. What began as scattered incidents quickly grew into waves of conflict, each more severe than the last. For the families who lived through it, there was no sense of safety. For the children who watched their neighborhoods burn, those memories would shape their lives forever. And yet, even amid the chaos, there were voices of resilience. Churches opened their doors to shelter frightened families. Community leaders demanded justice, speaking out even when it placed them at risk. Black-owned newspapers reported the truth when mainstream outlets refused. These moments of courage remind us that history is not just a record of tragedy, but also a testament to survival. The story of the Red Summer is not simply about what was lost, it's about the lessons that still echo today. When we ignore division, it festers. When fear is allowed to spread unchecked, it can consume entire cities. But when people speak up, demand fairness, and refuse to be silenced, change becomes possible. That is why remembering this chapter of history matters. It is not a distant story. It is a warning, a reminder, and, ultimately, a call to action. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, I invite you to support this channel. Give this video a like, share it with others who care about uncovering hidden history, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Together, we can keep these voices alive and make sure the lessons of the past are never forgotten. The roots of the unrest in 1919 were not sudden, nor were they simple. They had been planted years earlier, nourished by the social, political, and economic shifts that defined early 20th century America. By the time the First World War ended, the soil was heavy with tension, and all it needed was a spark. Imagine the scene, soldiers returning home after years of battle in Europe. Many of them were young African American men who had worn the uniform with pride. They had fought with courage, believing that their sacrifices would finally change the way their nation saw them. After all, how could a country deny respect to those who had risked everything in its defense? But when these men stepped off the trains and back into their neighborhoods, they found that nothing had changed. Instead of open arms, there were closed doors. Instead of respect, there was resistance. Their service medals carried little weight in a society still defined by old barriers. At the same time, another great movement was reshaping the map of America. Families were leaving the cotton fields and small towns of the South, setting their eyes on industrial cities of the North. They boarded trains with little more than suitcases and hope, joining what would later be called the Great Migration. To them, the cities represented opportunity, factories with steady wages, schools for their children, neighborhoods where they could dream bigger dreams. Yet when they arrived, they found themselves in crowded blocks, squeezed into housing that was already scarce. Their determination to build a better life collided with the anxieties of those who felt their presence was a threat. Work was at the heart of the tension. Factories had thrived during the war, churning out weapons and supplies, but with peace came layoffs and reduced wages. White workers returning from the front expected to reclaim their old jobs, only to find that many of those positions were now filled by black migrants who had kept the industries running. Resentment simmered. Strikes broke out. Employers, eager to keep production moving, sometimes hired black workers as replacements, deepening the divide between groups who should have been united by the same struggle for fair treatment. Overlaying all of this was a belief system that had never been dismantled. For generations, white dominance had been presented not just as tradition but as the natural order. It lingered in the laws, in the schools, in the stories printed on front pages. Newspapers published sensational headlines that cast African American communities as dangerous or unruly. Films like The Birth of a Nation spread harmful images that painted entire groups as threats. These messages were not just entertainment or information, they were tools that reinforced old fears and kept suspicion alive. The combination was combustible. A society shaken by war. Migrants crowding into cities. Jobs scarce, housing limited, and rumors running unchecked. Every small spark, an argument on a street corner, a rumor of misconduct, a misunderstanding at a workplace, had the potential to ignite something larger. And because those sparks were landing on ground already dry with resentment, the fires spread quickly. But it wasn't only fear of losing jobs or homes. Beneath those surface tensions was a deeper struggle: who would be allowed to claim the promise of America? Returning veterans wanted the respect their service deserved. Migrant families wanted the dignity of stable lives. Yet each step forward was met with pushback from those determined to guard what they believed was their exclusive right. The fight was not just about wages or housing, it was about belonging, identity, and the power to define the nation's future. For many African American families, this was a bitter realization. They had left the South believing the North would be different. They had endured the hardships of war believing their country would finally recognize their worth. Instead, they discovered that discrimination simply wore a different face. The barriers were not gone, they had just been rebuilt in new forms. This clash of hopes and fears, of ambition and resistance, was the true seedbed of what history would call the Red Summer. It was not one event but many, erupting in city after city, fueled by the same underlying causes. Understanding these roots helps us see that the violence of that summer was not random. It was the outcome of years of tension, shaped by war, migration, economics, and deeply ingrained beliefs. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: when a society refuses to deal with injustice, when it buries inequality instead of addressing it, the pressure does not disappear. It builds. It waits. And when it finally surfaces, it can shake entire communities. That is why remembering these root causes is not simply about looking back, it is about recognizing patterns that can repeat if left unchecked. When the guns fell silent in Europe and the First World War finally came to an end, trains across America began to fill with soldiers returning home. Among them were thousands of African American men who had served with courage and determination on foreign soil. They had marched through the mud of France, endured the thunder of artillery, and carried the weight of a nation's hopes on their shoulders. Many of them believed that their service had earned them something greater than a uniform or a medal, they believed it had earned them respect. As the trains pulled into crowded stations, families gathered with banners and cheers. Mothers wept with pride, children waved small flags, and wives clutched flowers as they searched the crowd for familiar faces. For the men stepping onto the platform, there was a moment of triumph. They stood tall, their uniforms still carrying the scent of the battlefields overseas, their chests heavy with the memory of sacrifice. In their hearts, they carried a vision of a different America, an America that would see them not as outsiders, but as heroes. But the reality that awaited them was far different. The same men who had been trusted with rifles and sent to defend freedom abroad returned to neighborhoods where freedom was still fragile. Instead of open arms, they found suspicion. Instead of recognition, they found resentment. The pride of their service quickly met the cold silence of a society unwilling to honor their contribution. The medals they carried seemed to weigh less than the prejudice they encountered on their own streets. For many veterans, the contrast was staggering. In France, they had marched through villages where strangers cheered them, offering bread and shelter. Overseas, their uniforms were symbols of honor. Back home, those same uniforms often drew unwanted attention, marking them as targets for hostility. What they thought would be a bridge into acceptance became a reminder of a promise unfulfilled. These men had left for war with a sense of duty, but they returned with a sense of betrayal. They had fought not only for their country but for the hope that their families would inherit a better future. They imagined coming back to steady jobs, decent housing, and the chance to walk through their communities with dignity. Instead, they discovered that opportunities were scarce, and doors were still closed. Employers who had relied on them during wartime now turned them away. Landlords restricted where they could live. The welcome they expected never arrived. Yet even in the face of this rejection, many veterans refused to surrender the pride they had earned overseas. They carried themselves with a confidence that could not be erased. Their very presence, disciplined, uniformed, determined, challenged the old boundaries of society. They were no longer willing to shrink into silence. They knew what it meant to stand against overwhelming odds, and they brought that same resolve back with them. This determination unsettled many who had grown comfortable with the way things were. The sight of veterans demanding their place in the nation's story sparked fear in those who believed change would diminish their own standing. Newspapers spread rumors, politicians stirred anxieties, and communities braced against what they perceived as a challenge to the old order. The very qualities that made these men heroes overseas, courage, resilience, and pride, made them targets at home. Still, the veterans pressed forward. They joined civic organizations, spoke out in churches, and inspired younger generations with stories of their service. They reminded their communities that they had already proven their loyalty to the nation. They had faced enemies abroad without flinching, surely, they could face injustice at home with the same resolve. In this way, their return marked not just the end of war, but the beginning of a new struggle. The story of these veterans is not simply one of disappointment, it is also one of awakening. They returned with eyes opened wider than before, with a sharper understanding of what was at stake. Their journey was a reminder that true change does not come as a gift, it must be demanded, earned, and protected. Their presence in American cities after the war helped spark conversations, inspired movements, and fueled a determination that would echo for decades. As we remember their story, we see men who carried both pride and pain, both honor and frustration. They returned as warriors, but they became something more, symbols of resilience in a nation still learning what freedom truly means. Their footsteps across train platforms, city streets, and neighborhood gatherings remind us that service to one's country is not just about fighting abroad, it is about standing firm for justice at home. In the years following the First World War, America was not only a nation in transition, it was also a nation being shaped by the stories it chose to tell. Newspapers, pamphlets, and films had the power to sway entire communities, and in those tense years, many of the stories being spread were far from fair. Instead of building bridges, they deepened divides. Instead of calming fears, they fed them. Imagine walking into a theater in 1915, the lights dimming as the first flickering images appeared on the screen. Audiences were mesmerized. Moving pictures were still new, still magical, and few people questioned what they saw. But what those films often presented was not entertainment alone, it was a message, carefully crafted to stir emotions and reinforce dangerous ideas. One film in particular, hailed at the time as a masterpiece of cinema, carried a message that would echo for years. It did not simply tell a story, it shaped how countless viewers saw their neighbors. At the same time, newspapers lined every corner, their bold headlines grabbing attention. Many editors knew that fear sold more papers than calm reflection. Instead of reporting fairly, they chose to sensationalize. Minor incidents were exaggerated into looming threats. Rumors were published as fact. Each headline, each article, added fuel to an already smoldering fire. For readers who trusted what they saw in print, these stories became truth, even when they were little more than fiction dressed up in ink. The power of these messages was not in a single film or article, but in their repetition. Day after day, week after week, people were told that their way of life was under attack. They were warned that the growing presence of African American families in their cities was a danger rather than an opportunity. They were reminded, again and again, to be suspicious of change. Over time, these repeated messages carved grooves into the public imagination, making fear feel natural and prejudice feel justified. This atmosphere of suspicion meant that even ordinary events could be twisted into something menacing. A neighbor moving into a new house, a worker taking on a factory job, or a veteran walking proudly in uniform, all of these everyday sights could be recast as proof of some larger threat. The media's biased storytelling transformed moments that should have been celebrated into reasons for division. The fear that spread was not born of reality, but of the stories people were told. For African American communities, this bias was not just insulting, it was dangerous. Families working hard to build a better life found themselves painted as villains in narratives they did not write. Their successes were twisted into threats, their struggles ignored. Each unfair headline and misleading film scene added another layer of difficulty to lives already marked by challenge. It became clear that they were fighting not only for jobs and homes, but also against a tide of falsehoods that shaped how others saw them. Yet even in the midst of this storm, there were those who resisted. Black-owned newspapers rose to the challenge, determined to tell a different story. They reported the truth when others spread rumors. They highlighted achievements when others ignored them. They gave voice to those who had long been silenced, proving that the pen could also be a weapon of justice. Their work was not easy, and their reach was limited compared to the massive circulation of mainstream outlets, but their words offered hope and clarity to communities desperate for fairness. The clash between biased narratives and truthful reporting revealed just how powerful stories could be. It showed that what people read in the paper or saw on the screen could shape how they treated their neighbors, how they voted, and even how they responded when conflict broke out. In many ways, the unrest of 1919 was not only fought in the streets, it was fought in the headlines and in the theaters, where perception became as important as reality. Looking back, it is clear that the role of propaganda and media bias cannot be underestimated. They were not background noise, they were central players in shaping a national crisis. They remind us of a lesson that still matters today: the stories we consume have consequences. When they are told with honesty, they can build empathy and understanding. When they are told with prejudice, they can divide and destroy. The Red Summer was a tragedy born of many causes, but the role of media and propaganda was like wind fanning flames. Without it, tensions might still have boiled over. With it, those tensions erupted in ways that scarred entire communities. To understand this chapter of history, we must remember not only the events themselves but also the stories that framed them, because those stories, more than anything else, shaped how people saw one another in a time when clarity and compassion were most needed. The summer of 1919 was marked not by one tragedy, but by many. Across the United States, entire cities found themselves torn apart by unrest. Each place had its own spark, its own story, and its own scars. To truly understand the Red Summer, we must step into these cities and see how a single incident could unravel into something far greater than anyone expected. In Chicago, it was a sweltering day in late July. The beaches along Lake Michigan were crowded with families seeking relief from the heat. Among them was a young man named Eugene Williams. He was just 17 years old, eager for a swim with friends. But on that day, the invisible lines that divided Chicago were more dangerous than the waves themselves. As Eugene drifted across a section of water unofficially claimed by white bathers, stones were thrown in his direction. Struggling to stay afloat, he sank beneath the surface. When word spread of his drowning, the city exploded. What began as grief quickly turned into outrage, and what followed was one of the deadliest urban conflicts of that summer. Homes were burned, businesses destroyed, and the streets filled with chaos for nearly a week. Far to the east, the nation's capital faced its own turmoil. Washington, D.C., was no stranger to tension, but in July of 1919, the city became a battlefield of rumor and retaliation. False reports circulated about supposed attacks, whispered from person to person, repeated in newspapers, and shouted in taverns. These stories, though unverified, carried weight in a city already brimming with unease. Crowds gathered, tempers flared, and within hours the city descended into violence. What had started as baseless gossip quickly grew into days of rioting, leaving neighborhoods scarred and families displaced. The power of rumor proved devastating, showing how fear can spread faster than truth. And then there was Elaine, Arkansas. Unlike the crowded streets of Chicago or the bustling avenues of Washington, Elaine was a rural town, surrounded by fields worked by sharecroppers. For generations, African American farmers had toiled under unfair conditions, their labor enriching landowners while leaving their own families struggling. In the autumn of 1919, they began to organize, demanding fair compensation for their harvests. Meetings were held quietly, hopes were whispered carefully, but word of their efforts spread. Instead of being met with negotiation, their call for justice was met with violence. What began as a dispute over wages escalated into one of the bloodiest episodes of that summer. Armed groups descended on the community, and the violence that followed left a deep scar not only on Elaine but on the memory of the entire region. Though these three stories unfolded in different places, they were bound together by common threads. In Chicago, it was the injustice of a boy's death. In Washington, it was the danger of rumor. In Elaine, it was the fight for dignity in the fields. Each story revealed a different face of the same reality, that beneath the surface of everyday life in America lay divisions that could erupt at any moment. The tragedy is not only in the violence itself, but in what it meant for the families caught in its path. Parents who sent their children to the beach never expected to bring them home in grief. Residents of the capital city never imagined that a whisper could set their streets ablaze. Farmers who asked only for fairness never believed their demand would cost them so much. Their stories remind us that history is not made only by great battles or political speeches. Sometimes, it is shaped by the choices of ordinary people, by a stone thrown on a beach, by a rumor repeated in a crowd, by a meeting held in a small wooden church. What makes these events even more powerful is the resilience that followed. Chicago rebuilt, even as scars remained. Washington learned hard lessons about the danger of unchecked rumor. And in Elaine, the courage of sharecroppers who dared to speak up became a symbol of resistance, remembered long after the fields grew quiet again. These were not just tragedies, they were turning points. The Red Summer of 1919 is often remembered as a season of unrest, but it is also a collection of human stories. Stories of a young swimmer whose life was cut short, of a city undone by lies, of farmers who stood for their rights against impossible odds. Together, they remind us that history is not abstract, it is lived, felt, and endured by real people. And while the violence of that summer revealed deep divisions, the courage shown in its aftermath pointed to the possibility of something greater. By revisiting these stories, we give voice to those who were silenced and ensure that the lessons of the past remain with us. Because every drowning, every rumor, every cry for justice deserves to be remembered, not only as a warning of what went wrong, but as a call to imagine what can be made right. In moments of crisis, people naturally look to authority for protection. When the streets erupt in chaos, when homes are threatened, when fear spreads from one family to the next, the sight of a uniform is supposed to bring reassurance. The police, the courts, and the government exist to uphold order, to shield the vulnerable, and to ensure that justice is not merely an idea but a living reality. Yet during the Red Summer of 1919, those expectations were shattered. In city after city, as violence spread, African American communities discovered that the very institutions meant to protect them were either absent or turned against them. Crowds marched through neighborhoods, breaking into homes and businesses, while those inside waited for help that never arrived. The sound of sirens, when it came, often brought not relief but dread. Law enforcement officers appeared, but too often their presence meant the arrest of those who had dared to defend their families rather than those who had instigated the unrest. In Chicago, as neighborhoods burned, many residents took it upon themselves to form protective lines around their streets. Fathers stood guard outside doorways, veterans used the discipline they had learned overseas to organize defense, and young men rushed to shield the elderly and the children. Yet when officers arrived, they rarely distinguished between those attacking and those defending. Arrest records swelled with names of African Americans accused of disorder, while many of the attackers simply melted back into the crowd without consequence. The message was clear: the scales of justice were not balanced. In Washington, D.C., the contrast was even more striking. For days, the capital of the nation descended into violence. Rumors fueled mobs, and citizens feared for their safety. One might imagine that in the heart of American government, the response would be swift and impartial. Instead, hesitation and inaction defined the early days of unrest. African American veterans who had fought bravely in France returned home to find themselves once again on the front lines, this time against their own countrymen. They defended their neighborhoods with the same courage they had shown overseas, yet it was they who were arrested when the fighting subsided. The institutions that should have recognized their service instead treated them as criminals for refusing to be victims. And in Elaine, Arkansas, the story was perhaps the most devastating. Sharecroppers had gathered to discuss fair wages and better treatment, a peaceful effort to claim the dignity their labor deserved. But when violence erupted, the response from officials was not to calm the situation or protect the innocent. Instead, it was to call in armed forces who treated the farmers themselves as the enemy. Men who asked for nothing more than fairness were rounded up, accused of crimes they did not commit, and forced into courtrooms where justice was a stranger. Those responsible for the bloodshed walked away free, while those who had suffered most bore the weight of punishment. What made these failures even more painful was the trust that had been betrayed. Generations had been taught that the law was a shield, that government was the voice of order, and that in times of need, authority would stand above personal bias. Yet in 1919, again and again, the evidence told a different story. For African American families, the lesson was bitter: when danger came, they could not rely on officials to protect them. Instead, they had to rely on one another. Still, from this betrayal rose resilience. Communities began to organize not only for survival but for justice. Churches became centers of coordination, newspapers chronicled the truth when official reports distorted it, and leaders emerged determined to hold institutions accountable. If the law would not protect them, they would demand that the law be changed. If the government would not hear them, they would raise their voices louder until they could not be ignored. The Red Summer revealed that the greatest wound was not only the violence of the mobs but the silence, or complicity, of those sworn to uphold justice. It showed that when institutions fail, communities must rise to fill the void. The courage of those who defended their families, even in the face of arrest, was not in vain. It planted seeds of determination that would later grow into movements demanding civil rights, equality, and true justice under the law. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the chaos of the riots themselves, the destruction, and the loss. But equally important is the realization that the absence of protection was itself an act of harm. To stand by while violence rages is to allow it to flourish. To punish those who defend themselves while excusing those who ignite conflict is to rewrite justice into injustice. The story of law enforcement and government during the Red Summer is not just about failure, it is about the awakening that follows when people realize that change will not come from silence. It is about communities that refuse to surrender to despair, who saw clearly that if justice was to be real, it would have to be demanded. Their struggle reminds us that the strength of a society is measured not by the words written in law books, but by whether those words are lived out when they matter most. When violence swept across cities and towns in 1919, leaving families broken and neighborhoods in ruins, there was one force that refused to let the truth vanish into silence: the black press. At a time when mainstream newspapers often distorted events or ignored them altogether, African American journalists took it upon themselves to record what was really happening. They were not just reporting, they were preserving memory, giving voice to those who might otherwise have been erased from the story. Imagine picking up a newspaper in Chicago or New York in those days. If it was one of the big national dailies, the headlines might frame entire communities as the cause of unrest, twisting facts to fit the fears of the majority. But if you turn to the pages of the Chicago Defender or the Crisis, you would find something very different: names of the victims, eyewitness accounts, photographs that showed the devastation, and editorials demanding accountability. These publications became lifelines for people desperate to understand the chaos around them, and for history itself, they became vital records that could not be silenced. The black press did more than describe events, it gave them meaning. Writers reminded readers that the violence of the Red Summer was not an accident, nor the result of random conflict, but the product of long-standing injustice. They pointed to the courage of veterans defending their families, the resilience of sharecroppers standing up for fair pay, and the dignity of communities that rebuilt even after devastation. Each article, each editorial, was both a record and a rallying cry. At the same time, another force was stepping onto the national stage, the NAACP. Under the leadership of figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson, the organization saw the Red Summer as more than a tragedy, it was proof that the nation's promises of equality were being broken. They refused to let those promises go unchallenged. The NAACP began compiling reports, gathering testimonies, and sending investigators into the very cities where violence had torn communities apart. Their findings were grim, but they refused to look away. James Weldon Johnson traveled into some of the most hostile areas, speaking with survivors and documenting their stories. He called what was happening not a series of riots, as newspapers liked to claim, but a war waged by one part of the citizenry against another. His words reframed the violence, stripping away excuses and revealing it for what it truly was: organized attempts to suppress an entire population. Through his work and the collective efforts of the NAACP, the scale of the injustice could no longer be hidden behind sensational headlines or government silence. But raising awareness was not enough, they sought change in the law itself. The NAACP threw its weight behind federal anti-lynching legislation, pushing for a bill that would finally make such acts a crime under national law. They believed that without federal intervention, local authorities, who so often stood idle or joined in the violence, would never hold perpetrators accountable. The dire anti-lynching bill became the focus of their campaign, a beacon of hope that the federal government might finally recognize its responsibility to protect all citizens. Rallies were organized, petitions circulated, and editorials printed in papers across the country. Supporters in Congress spoke passionately about the need for justice. The bill even passed in the House of Representatives, a sign that momentum was on their side. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the tide might be turning. But in the Senate, the measure met a wall of resistance. Southern politicians, determined to preserve the system of racial dominance that had fueled the Red Summer in the first place, blocked its passage. They used every tool available: filibusters, procedural delays, political bargaining, to ensure the bill never became law. It was a crushing blow, not only to the NAACP but to every community that had hoped for real protection from violence. Yet even in defeat, the effort was not wasted. The campaign proved that injustice could be dragged into the light of Congress, debated on the floor of the nation's highest institutions, and forced into the consciousness of the American public. The failure of the anti-lynching bill revealed the depth of the struggle ahead, but it also sharpened the resolve of those fighting for change. The partnership between the black press and the NAACP during this period was powerful. One gave voice to the lived experiences of the people, the other transformed those voices into political demands. Together, they ensured that the Red Summer was not buried beneath silence or distortion. They laid the foundation for later victories, planting seeds that would grow into the broader civil rights movement decades later. The story of their efforts is not only about what they achieved, but about what they refused to accept. They would not accept lies as truth. They would not accept violence as normal. They would not accept silence as the final word. Through their work, they turned grief into testimony, and testimony into action. In the end, the legacy of the black press and the NAACP during the Red Summer reminds us that history is not only written by those in power. It is also written by those who dare to speak when speaking is dangerous, who record when others try to erase, and who fight for laws that reflect justice, even when those laws are denied. Their struggle tells us that progress is rarely immediate, but every voice raised against injustice brings us one step closer to the day when silence is broken, and equality is more than a promise, it is reality. As the last embers of violence faded in 1919, communities across America were left to confront the wreckage. Streets once alive with children's laughter were marked by burned homes and shattered windows. Families mourned the lives of loved ones taken too soon, while others quietly packed their belongings, moving away in search of safety that felt increasingly out of reach. The Red Summer had ended, but its shadow remained, a haunting reminder that the struggle for equality was far from over. What this turbulent season revealed went far deeper than the immediate destruction. It laid bare a truth that many had long known but the nation often refused to acknowledge: oppression was not the work of a few individuals, nor the product of isolated incidents. It was systemic, woven into the very fabric of institutions meant to ensure fairness. From police who failed to intervene, to newspapers that spread dangerous falsehoods, to lawmakers who looked the other way, the violence thrived because the system allowed it to. Yet even in this darkness, something powerful emerged. The Red Summer became a catalyst, a turning point that stirred many to action. Survivors, journalists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens refused to let the story be silenced. Outrage turned into organizing, grief into determination. The NAACP, churches, and community groups began to build networks of resistance, pushing not only for safety but for dignity and rights. The violence had been meant to suppress, but instead, it gave birth to a new wave of activism that would ripple across the 20th century. For the individuals who lived through that summer, the scars were not only physical but emotional. Children grew up with memories of hiding under beds while chaos raged outside. Parents carried the quiet pain of dreams interrupted, of futures denied. These hidden scars, carried silently across generations, became part of the larger American story, a story too often left untold in classrooms and history books. Remembering them now is an act of honor, a way of restoring dignity to those who endured and ensuring their experiences are not forgotten. The lesson of the Red Summer is not confined to the past. It reminds us that injustice ignored will always return, that silence in the face of cruelty becomes complicity, and that true peace cannot be built on denial. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths, to look closely at systems of power, and to ask whether they protect all people equally. Most of all, it shows us the power of resilience, the unbreakable will of communities who, even when pushed to the margins, refuse to disappear. As we close this story, let us remember that history is more than a record of events. It is a mirror, reflecting who we have been, and a map, pointing toward who we might still become. The Red Summer of 1919 may have revealed the worst in America, but it also sparked the courage that would fuel decades of struggle for justice. That courage is a legacy we can still carry forward today. If you found meaning in this story and believe these voices deserve to be heard, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who care about truth and history, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the past, and until we meet again, I wish you a peaceful night's rest. Good night, everyone.